Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 13th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a jury finding Donald Trump did sexually abuse E. Jean Carroll in a department store in the 90s, Adam Price quitting as leader of Plaid Cymru after a report found misogyny, harassment and bullying in his party, and the 67th Eurovision Song Contest descending on Liverpool ahead of the final this weekend. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll and Jamie Timson, and we have a sparkly new addition to the lineup. It is staff writer for the Week's digital team, Harriet Marsden. Hello, Harriet.
Hi.
Welcome. Now, I know you've listened to the show before, so you may well be aware it is tradition here. There's nothing I can do about it. There's a gun against my head. I have to ask you now to tell me something about yourself that I would not be able to discover just by Googling you.
Well, I feed a pack of magpies on my balcony every day.
Nice.
It started off with one. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware that when they have babies, they stay where they are born. So now it's 9, and I don't know how many it'll be next year.
That's a hard thing to manage when I know you also have a cat that has appeared in the background of your webcam already. How do you keep it apart from the babies?
Well, she is terrified of the magpies, as is she's terrified of the 2 birds that I have in the house.
Fine. That went better than your introductory fact being, well, I feed the babies to the cat. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is Turkey ready for a change of leader?
Today's rally in Istanbul is probably the greatest in the ruling party's political history in the last 3 decades. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, who is on stage right now, just announced that 1.7 million Turkish people have attended this rally. The roads are jammed, the subways are jammed, and there have been tight security measures. And President Erdogan, who spoke yesterday, described the May 14 election as an election of survival.
Sinem Kosonidu doing her best to report for Al Jazeera there from an Erdogan rally in Istanbul on Sunday over the loudspeaker and the sirens and the crowd and everything else. What was she saying, Julia? What's the story?
So millions of people in Turkey are preparing to cast their votes this Sunday in the country's parliamentary and presidential elections. And as you heard there, President Erdogan has said that this is really an election of survival. Polling suggests that he could face his biggest political challenge yet after ruling the country for more than 20 years.
And so he's done some unconventional politics this week, hasn't he, to try and mitigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the polling is tight and he's clearly concerned. So he's announced a 45% pay rise that will go to 700,000 public sector workers. So a massive boost there. And this is just the latest in a series of public handouts that have come in recent months, including promises of a free month of natural gas for consumers, reduced electricity prices, but also increases to the minimum wage and pension for public workers.
Wow. I mean, Jamie, that 45% pay rise will seem to everybody listening, I'm sure, as it does to me, as a straightforward bribe. But might it work?
Well, what's the Turkish for magic money tree, I wonder? Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting election, really, and interesting to look back at Erdogan throughout his time in power, because I think when he first came into power in 2003 as prime minister, he actually made a lot of kind of reforms that you could be seen as being certainly more EU and West friendly, removed the death penalty, added new safeguards for free speech, and kind of really did seem to be pushing the country more towards the EU and EU accession. And that is kind of in kind of stark contrast to where we are now, where a lot of people see him as quite an authoritarian leader. And I mean, the main reason why this election is so kind of too close to call is the kind of massive currency crisis that's been happening in Turkey over the last year. Inflation hit 85% last year, which you do wonder how this 45% pay rise will affect inflation, if you're to believe any of the politicians and economists from this country.
Well, I suppose, Harriet, it's a question of whether the reason that he might be about to lose the election is because of the economy, or whether it's about him as a person, or is it about the earthquake, or is it a mix of all three?
I think that the earthquake and the economy are inextricably linked. Obviously, there was massive damage to the economy. But from what we're seeing so far, it does look as though if he were to lose, it would be far more related to the economics that Jamie was discussing. So the runaway inflation, the lira tumbling against the dollar, investment flooding out of the country, rather than any kind of response to his growing authoritarianism and his crackdowns on press freedom, for example, and the failed coup. So it's not the most heartening, but as various politicians in the past have said, it's all about the economy. Stupid.
So do you think really that if the economy was still doing as well as it was at the last election, the Turkish public would still put to one side the authoritarian stuff, the stuff that from the West feels pretty unpalatable?
I think the fact that it is currently as close as it is would suggest so, yeah. The fact that this growing authoritarianism is not in any way, it's not hidden, it doesn't go undiscussed. So the fact that the election currently looks as close as it is would suggest that if he were to lose, it would be far more about what's happened in the last few years, for example, with inflation, with the lira, with the central bank's unsustainable bolstering of the exchange rate, rather than him personally, who previously has enjoyed massively high popularity among the middle classes.
Who's he up against, Julia?
So his fiercest opposition is from the Unity presidential candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is the nominee for the Nation Alliance, which is a coalition of 6 pretty ideologically diverse parties. And he is a very interesting figure. He's painted himself, particularly in this campaign, as a stark opposition to Erdogan. He's earned himself the nickname the Turkish Gandhi, in part from...
Aiming low then.
Exactly. Setting good expectations. So he's softly spoken, he's very calm and sedate, and I really like this. He's been giving addresses from his kitchen at home, which people have been saying just looks like a very traditional house, the kind that their grandmas might have. So he's been really appealing to people in a very different style to Erdogan. Obviously, we heard that rally at the start, very loud by comparison.
And when you say the Unity candidate, that's not the name of his party, is it? You mean Unity because he represents a bunch of different interests, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So he is the leader of a coalition of 6 parties that have all grouped together behind him. And he does have support from other parties as well. It's quite interesting trying to pin down exactly what they stand for, because obviously all of those parties have different interests and sometimes competing interests. But one thing that they are all agreed on is that there needs to be a shift away from Erdogan's approach of this executive presidency and leaning towards authoritarianism.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it, Jamie? Because in the old system, before Erdogan intervened to turn it into a presidential runoff, they used to have coalition government, didn't they? Parties competing who would be the biggest. And Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, always was the biggest. And so they got to decide who governed. Then he changed the system, strongman politics. I want to be the big president. And now what they've done is all coalesce behind the kind of anyone but Erdogan candidate. And that could be his downfall.
Yeah. And I think there's also there's a third presidential candidate, Muharrem İnce, and he's standing basically in kind of comparison with Kemal, the kind of main opposition leader. There is a worry that that's going to draw some votes away from Kılıçdaroğlu, because obviously, it works a lot better if you've got one opposition person standing. The third person has said, actually, it should be me. But there is a thought, or at least analysts expect that drawing, splitting the opposition vote will mean that Erdogan will manage to get through to a runoff. So while, this election is much tighter than perhaps anyone expected, there is a strong feeling that we could still be seeing Erdogan winning out.
If he doesn't, though, Harriet, this is a big moment, isn't it? Not just for Turkey, which has been under the grip of him for so long, but actually, I suppose, for nativist populism all around the world.
Absolutely. And it's hugely significant for Europe and particularly the EU, with Turkey being, the second most populous country in Europe. It's very, very, very significant that it's been in this ongoing process over the last more than 20 years to try and join the EU, or what was originally the European Economic Community. So they signed the customs agreement in 1995, and Turkey was officially recognized as a candidate for the EU, or what was then the EEC, in 1999. So there's been ongoing negotiations, but it was stalled in 2016 over concerns of human rights violations under Erdogan, and the process has been officially suspended. So if the election doesn't go Erdogan's way, it could have huge implications for the potential for Turkey to join the EU, which was a very, very, very core message of the Vote Leave campaign group during the UK referendum.
But also, could it have implications, Julia, and this is what I was getting at, for other countries around the world who have had leaders that are in this mould, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro?
I guess potentially. I think there's so many particular factors at play in Turkey's case, obviously exacerbated by the earthquake. But another thing that could swing this election is that the country is about to see a massive increase in the number of first-time voters at these elections. It's about 8% of people who are expected to vote are voting for the first time. They're younger voters who typically are against Erdogan and are looking for a change. And so I think it really depends on the politics of those other countries as to whether we would see such a shift in other elections.
Harriet.
The elections in Turkey are hugely significant for other strongmen around the world, particularly Russia. Turkey is a very, very, very significant ally with Russia. It's very cozy with Putin. It's right on the front lines of the Ukraine. And also, it's one of the very few democracies. It's technically a democracy. Obviously, in reality, it's very much not democratic, but technically a democracy, one of the few in the Muslim world. So with that in mind, if Erdogan loses, then the alliances with Russia, potentially with China, and also with the Turkey's position on Ukraine could all change.
You do wonder, Julia, if Erdogan does lose, whether he'll just take a leaf out the Trump playbook, right? I mean, that's the man in his image. That's what he did. He just said, no, that's wrong. The election result's wrong. It's false. It's fake news. Then what? Yeah,
people are concerned that could happen, particularly if he were to lose by quite a tight margin. And in 2019, we did see this. His party challenged the mayoral election results in Istanbul and forced a rerun of the vote to happen.
Yes, that's right. We covered that on the show. Yeah, I forgot about that.
I mean, they ultimately lost it, and with a bigger margin, but it has obviously sown these seeds of concern as to whether he would accept the results.
He also told a interviewer in 1996, when he was mayor of Istanbul, democracy is like a tram. You ride it until you arrive at your destination, then you step off. Now, I said a lot of bad things in 1996 too, so he might have changed his opinions, but it certainly gives a bit of a hint in terms of where he was thinking at some point in his life.
Yes. And then just before you step off, you give the tram driver a 45% pay rise. Thank you for that, Julia. Harriet, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Harriet, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it time to give pregnant women a get-out-of-jail-free card?
In the community, women with high-risk pregnancies receive extra care from midwives and obstetricians. 1 in 5 appointments with midwives are missed by women in prison, and nearly 40% of women in prison miss outpatient appointments. This can be because there are not enough staff to escort women to those appointments.
Dr. Shona Minson from the Centre of Criminology at Oxford University talking to The Independent in 2020. Harriet, what's the story?
The story is that in September 2019, an 18-year-old gave birth at HMP Bronzefield Prison in Surrey, which is the UK's only private facility for female inmates and Europe's largest prison for women. So she gave birth without medical assistance while she was remanded there in custody, waiting for her trial. And although she rang her intercom and cell bell for help, no nurse or ambulance was called. She was forced to bite through the umbilical cord herself, and the baby was only discovered the following morning, despite the fact that the woman who's now known as Miss A, her cell was checked in the evening and in the morning. This was only discovered later when other prisoners alerted guards to a massive amount of blood on the walls and the floor. So the inquest is currently ongoing.
So what's happened this week?
This week, the inquest has heard that the deputy director of Bronzefield Prison has accepted in evidence that the response to the baby, Aisha Cleary, the mother of the baby, calling for help was completely inadequate. So that's a huge development in the ongoing investigation and inquest.
Jamie, does this give pause for thought just about the treatment of pregnant women in prisons, or more broadly about female inmates in general?
Yeah, I think, it's an obviously shocking case, but it does highlight the issues for, women make up around about 4% of the UK prison population. So there's roughly around more than 3,000 women incarcerated in a system that, let's be clear, it has been designed for men, often poor, marginalized and traumatized, and often also convicted for non-violent and petty crimes. Now, I, tend to fall on this side of things as being a bit of a prison abolitionist. But even if you're not going to take such an extreme view as that, you do have to wonder. There's a great, and I really recommend people go and watch it, a great kind of hour-long video with female ex-former prisoners that Tortoise Media did, looking at this very question about, female prisons and the problem with it. A lot of the testimony of people who have been in the system is that prison was the last thing that would benefit them. And yet they are being placed in situations and forcefully placed in situations that are not beneficial. And it really comes down to the question of, what do we see as the point of prisons? And if it is rehabilitation, or is it keeping people safe off the streets, or is it somewhere in between?
Okay, and I'm sure we'll go on to actually have that discussion in a couple of minutes' time. But if you accept that, although in this case this woman was awaiting trial, most women in prison have been sentenced to be in prison, and society says they should be in prison, whether you agree or disagree. It just seems basic, doesn't it, that if a woman's pregnant, there need to be extra resources to cope with that eventuality. It's not like it's unpredictable. It's a time bomb waiting to go off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty terrifying to think that actually those resources aren't there, and how terrifying it must be to be pregnant and in prison. I was looking at some stats into this, and recent research suggests that a pregnant woman is 7 times more likely to suffer a stillbirth than a woman in the community. And Tommy's, the pregnancy and baby loss charity, also found that women are 2 times more likely to give birth prematurely, which obviously puts both mum and baby at even higher risks. Then you also have to think about the necessary conditions for good pre- and postnatal health, good nutrition, comfort, fresh air, all those other factors that are so important for, again, both mother and baby.
And then I guess, Harriet, you have this sort of extra level of outrage, which is, as I say, that she actually hadn't been sentenced, this woman.
That's part of the problem. Obviously, she was remanded in custody, so there are questions being raised as to why a woman who at the time, when she was remanded into Bronzefield, estimated 6 or 7 month pregnant woman, why she was remanded in custody into a prison that has experienced other incidents of this type. There was one baby born in October 2017 in Bronzefield who required intensive care in hospital and survived, and another stillborn in an ambulance en route to the hospital in December 17. So with it in mind that almost all campaigners and experts, medical and of the prison system, agree that pregnant women should not be remanded in custody or imprisoned, because the system is not set up for pregnant women. And the UN rules suggest that non-custodial sentences for pregnant women should be preferred.
I guess the obvious challenge to that, though, is, and I know that most women in prison have committed very different offences to the men that are in prison. Nonetheless, there are some women in prison who are violent and dangerous. What about those women? Are you saying they shouldn't have non-custodial sentences just because they're pregnant?
So it's an interesting question. Firstly, as Jamie said, the vast majority of women in prison are in prison for non-violent crimes. And considering that 6% roughly at any given time, an estimated 6% of the female population, of the inmate population, are pregnant, with about it's a very small number of women. So you could also consider it on a case-by-case basis. But most experts also agree that alternatives like community orders and out-of-court disposals and non-punitive residential support like therapeutic communities and women's centres are significantly more effective.
Yeah, but those aren't appropriate for someone who's violent and dangerous, are they? So you do accept that on a case-by-case basis, there may be some women where it's really pushing this system, like that there just isn't a facility to put them into at the moment. That's the situation we're in.
Unfortunately, though, if the alternative is that you are effectively sentencing them to a far higher rate of stillbirths, a far higher rate of premature births, significant, as documented by all the reports into this issue, significant fear and stress and shame of being a pregnant woman in custody and prison, you're effectively sentencing them to extra punishment. And you're also sentencing the baby that has not committed any crime.
Okay, so let's broaden this out, as you were hinting at earlier, JB, then, into, I hesitate to say the words really, because it's not exactly a vote winner, is it? But whether we shouldn't be imprisoning women at all.
Yeah, the reason that the prison system is in this situation is purely because it's not a vote winner. And, you know, the nuance that is clearly being cried out for when people discuss about this kind of stuff is just not available because the funding is not there. And, you know, there's such a backlog in the courts, there's such a backlog in the prisons, there's such a just negligence on the part of the government and state for the prison population that we've ended up in a situation where you can't treat things on a case-by-case basis because there just isn't the facilities available for that. There was a YouGov poll last year that said that 2/3 of Britons think that sentences that courts hand down to people aren't harsh enough. And 2% say sentences were too harsh. And I think 12% said that the courts got the balance right. But so that's 2/3 of people who think actually we should be doing more, locking up more people. And, you know, you only have to look at the attack ads that were on Sunak from Labour. It's both sides of the party that think you need to be tough on crime and the causes of crime. So
because their focus groups tell them that's what people vote on.
Those questions are not broken down in terms of gender. Those questions, the polling, the attack ads, public opinion is all... It's not broken down in terms of male and female inmates. When you actually question people, when you question experts, when you question lawyers, medical campaigners, everyone with any kind of expertise in the justice system, there is near unanimous agreement across the board that women being sentenced for non-violent crimes should not be given custodial prison sentences.
Just outline why that is. Why do people think that?
There are so many factors involved here. As Jamie said, the prison system was designed for men, which means that's contributed to the fact that there's far, far higher rates, disproportionately higher rates of self-harm and suicide and abuse among the women's inmate population. And because women are being sentenced to custodial sentences for non-violent crimes, you're also creating a situation where the punishment doesn't necessarily fit the crime, but because of the parole system and many, many, many reforms to the parole system that have been ongoing since 2015 and cuts to parole services, the rates of recidivism among female inmates are disproportionately higher and growing as well.
But those could be taken as arguments to improve the prison facility. So why is it an argument to not send women to prison at all? What's different about the crimes that women do?
Because if the purpose of a prison sentence is to reduce rates of violent crime and the purpose of prison sentences is to reform and rehabilitate people, in the future and prevent crime in the future, then it doesn't do that. Particularly in the case of women who are sentenced to custodial sentences that have children. So there are significantly high rates of children around the country whose mothers are being sentenced and put in prison, which is creating huge implications among the community. And so many of these children end up in the care system or are otherwise unbelievably traumatized and affected. So it's got this wider implication in the community for imprisoning women that makes it very, very difficult to justify. There are very few cases of female prisoners where it's agreed that they cannot be rehabilitated.
Yeah, and I guess we also have to think about, I mean, as we were saying, on a case-by-case basis, if you also look at these prisoners as individuals and assess their individual vulnerabilities, the situations that have led them to potentially get involved in different types of crime and potentially more serious crimes, there's just so many factors at play before it even gets to the point of a woman entering the prison system. I mean, ultimately, this does come down to each country's own criminal justice system. And I found it really interesting researching this, that there are a number of countries around the world that prohibit or at least have laws in place that really curtail the imprisonment of pregnant women. There's not many, there's 11, which include Russia, Ukraine and Brazil, which I thought was quite interesting in itself. But also this research, which was done by Coventry University, published last year, it highlighted Italy and Portugal as really good examples of approaches that could be adopted in the UK, which having laws in place that protect pregnant women and also mothers of young women from incarceration, and taking into account those special states of vulnerability when deciding sentencing, taking into account alternatives such as home detention, electric monitoring, house arrest. So I think, this conversation has obviously brought to light how potentially a new approach is really significantly needed. There are other countries who are adopting it. It's just whether the conversation will ever get to that point in the UK, because the government doesn't seem keen to have it.
Indeed. Okay, Jamie, you're up next after this. Okay, Jamie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we learnt why Cleopatra won't be coming at you in quite the same way as before.
There was a time long ago when women ruled with unparalleled power as warriors, queens, mothers of nations. And there is none among them more iconic than Cleopatra.
I would die for Egypt. What would you die for? I am Isis. I am a god.
As long as she's alive, she is the pharaoh.
The official Netflix trailer for docudrama Queen Cleopatra, which you can stream now. Jamie, I know you love a box set, but why is this your story of the week?
Bloody love a good box set, I do. So yeah, it's come out this week, Queen Cleopatra. I've quite had the chance to see it yet.
It puts you in the perfect position to comment then.
You know what? I've been on this podcast before where we don't tend to watch the things that we're talking about, but we really do have opinions on it. So I'm ready. I'm ready to bring a bit more of. But what's lucky for us is that it's mainly the furore around it has mainly come from the trailer, which I have seen, Ollie.
Well, I've just seen the trailer. So, I mean, let's just cut to the jib here. I mean, Cleopatra's black, right? That's maybe the surprise for some.
Played by Britain's Adele James. And so it's caused a bit of a furore in Egypt because some Egyptians have said that Queen Cleopatra had light skin and Greek features. That included the Ministry for Tourism and Antiquities, who criticised Netflix for casting James, described her as having African features and dark skin. It obviously throws up that question of when we're looking at drama or docudramas or history, the importance of race and viewing these things through the lens of today is an interesting one. If you, in terms of historians, and there are historians involved in the production, and part of the docudrama is that there's people talking about it while she's acting it out, like a kind of a fun version of a Talking Heads type vibe. And they've obviously, it's been informed by them basically saying that, she has some of the cultural heritage of black people. And it is disputed whether or not Cleopatra was black or white.
What do you make of the reaction of the Egyptians, Harriet? Is there more to it than just oh no, she didn't look like that? Is it, this business of African features and dark skin, is this hinting at something that's a problem in the Egyptian psyche?
I mean, it's quite clearly about race, isn't it, Ollie? Because there is no complaint made about casting a British woman, where we know for sure that Cleopatra wasn't British. We're not 100% clear on what Cleopatra looked like or her ethnic makeup. There's elements that she's got ancestry of Macedonian Greek and Persian, or Iranian now, but at the time Persian. There's also questions over whether she possibly had Jewish heritage. This debate over the race and appearance of Cleopatra has been going back for over a century. And so the fact that they have highlighted this actress's dark skin and African features would suggest to me that this is far more about race than any kind of authenticity. And particularly because Cleopatra is really, what we do know for sure is that Cleopatra was the first ruler in Egypt that really embraced Egypt. Even though she was of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she spoke Egyptian. She styled herself as Isis, an Egyptian goddess, and embodied this idea of Egypt as a unified entity that was very, very, very new. So actually, whether or not she was light-skinned, or whether she was blonde or Jewish or black or white, is in fact not relevant to what she's known for, which is for being an incredible female ruler, but also for being very, very, very much an Egyptian ruler, even if she wasn't Egyptian. So in that sense, an African-looking actress is more authentic.
Yeah, but is it the business of Americans and Brits to really have a significant opinion on this, Julia, when she was Egyptian in the sense that she was in Egypt, and she is Egypt's cultural icon? And, in 1963, no one asked Egyptians what they thought about Elizabeth Taylor playing Cleopatra, right? But part of the reason that Egyptians feel they now have a voice on this is because we're in a climate where you're supposed to consult the people you're reflecting. It's an Egyptian story. Egypt is saying, we don't see Cleopatra like that. Is their voice not legitimate?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think, it ultimately just comes down to whatever the motivation of the filmmakers is, doesn't it? Whether it ultimately just comes down to profits and viewing figures, or whether actually you're trying to make a documentary that is faithful in its retelling, that consults the, most highly knowledgeable experts in the field, that also grapples with these complexities and doesn't necessarily shy away from them. I was thinking about how, as we were saying, there's been other depictions before this has come up previously with other actors who've been cast as Cleopatra. And it feels like actually in this kind of format where it's basically going to be led by academic discussion, and then there'll be these dramatizations. Actually, it could have worked to have a few different actors. Like, it didn't necessarily have to be pinned to just one. And that could have been a really good and interesting way of engaging the audience with this very complicated academic conversation that is still lively and ongoing. So it kind of feels like a missed opportunity.
There does seem to be an issue with Cleopatra in general that goes beyond perhaps even race, Harriet, because this isn't the first time these conversations come up, has it? There was also a furore over Gal Gadot's casting as her in 2020. And, she's an Ashkenazi Jewish Israeli.
Which is interesting because there is some suggestion that Cleopatra had Jewish ancestry, that she certainly spoke Hebrew. So if we're talking about authenticity and we're talking about historical accuracy, Netflix docudramas are known for neither.
Yeah, but if there was suddenly a Black Prince Charles in The Crown, we would be saying, well, that's just not accurate, wouldn't we?
But what I'm saying is, why does it matter? I mean, for example, when an American, Natalie Portman, was cast as Anne Boleyn in an American film, there wasn't any fuss over that, despite the fact that Henry VIII was also an American, and Scarlett Johansson, also an American, played Mary Boleyn. No uproar about that, but there was an uproar when there was a Black British actress cast as Anne Boleyn. So let's just be clear that this is about race and not about authenticity, because nobody is making a fuss about Americans being cast as Brits, or for that matter, about Americans being cast as Egyptians.
Can we talk about accents briefly? Does it matter that? Does it annoy you when Americans play characters?
Anne Hathaway in One Day, obviously the go-to one, but that was one of the worst accents I've literally ever heard.
Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on. I don't believe Mary Poppins is a docudrama. What I'm asking is, does it matter when you have... John Lithgow playing Winston Churchill would be my example here. You can just hear that he's not quite English. Does that bother you? Like, how accurate does it need to be?
I think the question about, like, when you look at film representations of history, there was a good thing I read about Oliver Stone's JFK and how that caused the massive look into the conspiracy behind the murder of John F. Kennedy and whether that had an effect on the actual national psyche and the American conscience. So there probably is a question about, if the only thing that a younger person in the UK or in the West is aware of about Cleopatra is, rather than the excellent 90s girl band, is this Netflix documentary. If that's their first introduction to Queen Cleopatra, is there a need for, like you say, Harriet, authenticity, or are we able to, it's the same discussions we've had about The Crown, are we able to separate it a bit and be able to just put up a screen card beforehand that says, you know what, this is a dramatization? I guess you just got to trust people a little bit to know, even if this is my first interaction with Queen Cleopatra, to just go and search it out for yourself a bit more.
It's also about presenting it to a younger audience, isn't it, Julia? I mean, you can tell even just from the way this trailer is made that it's going to appeal to a different demographic to, a BBC 4 Talking Heads show.
Yeah, that's true. I think maybe the fact, because I was thinking actually about on the accent point, how they could have done it better. I did find it quite jarring that she has a British accent in the trailer. And they could have had, actors in Egyptian with subtitles, but actually then that does make it less accessible to a new audience potentially. And I thought there was some interesting academic discussion around it. Associate Professor of Classics, Rebecca Futu Kennedy, spoke to Time magazine about it. And her point ultimately was just that if you get too fixated and too bogged down in these discussions, then you kind of lose the opportunity to learn and also to start presenting these incredible histories and the research that is out there to new audiences. So obviously this is very important, and also the horrendous response that the actors had to go through as a result. They've had to turn comments off on the YouTube video of the trailer because people were being so racist. That's completely unacceptable, and actually kind of now the conversation has dwarfed the initial point of the project.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say. I think it's also really important to note that even though this is a docudrama that Netflix is creating for profit for a largely English-speaking audience, so as a business decision, this casting makes absolute sense. But there is a wealth of books and podcasts and historical documentaries and any number of other very academic, as accurate as possible, non-dramatizations of Cleopatra's life. She's one of the most well-known, studied and discussed women and people in the history of the world. So if you were going to decide that you thought that this Netflix documentary, this docudrama, which is made for profit and for entertainment ultimately, was not your bag, was not your historical source that you wanted, you could go anywhere else.
Jamie, care to name a song by Cleopatra apart from Coming At You?
That one is actually called Cleopatra's Theme, to be fair to them. It's not called Coming At You.
Forgive me. The album was called Coming At You. I'm on the Wikipedia page. Thank ABBA for the music they released with Steps, Tina Cousins, Bewitched and Billy.
Oh, you know what? I had that on a CD. I think it was like Now 47 or something. It was good. Definitely go and listen to Cleopatra. Watch the docudrama. Have a good time, guys.
I think rather like the Netflix docudrama, if investigating Cleopatra's musical work leads you to find out more about Bewitched, that can't be a bad thing. My thanks to Jamie, Harriet and Julia. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, I'm coming at you.